1977, a well-respected pastor from a small town in Arkansas disappeared without a single clue. For decades, the local faith community was left to wonder what truly happened. But 25 years later, deep in the woods, a logger stumbled upon something no one was ever supposed to find, a discovery that would reopen a long cold case and bring a family back to the edge of something they had given up on: answers. Marcus Freeman, now 42, sat in the stillness of his apartment near the Ozark Mountains. It was early Friday morning. The faint background noise of the TV barely filled the room as he absent-mindedly flipped through channels, trying to distract himself. Nothing was on, just infomercials and early morning sermons. One of those sermons caught his eye. A preacher stood beneath stained glass windows, passionately delivering his message. For a moment, Marcus couldn't look away. The scene stirred a pain he thought he had buried. It reminded him of his father, Reverend Elijah Freeman, a voice once so full of conviction, a man who vanished without a word. The wound had never healed, and Marcus quickly changed the channel, unable to face what he'd lost. That's when the phone rang. He answered, expecting a routine call, maybe a wrong number, but the voice on the other end froze him in place. "Mr. Freeman, this is Detective Sarah Miller. We believe we found something connected to your father's disappearance." Marcus tightened his grip on the phone. "Is this a joke? That case is over 2 decades old." "I understand why you'd think that," she replied calmly. "But I assure you, this isn't a prank." Earlier this morning, a logger working in a remote area found an old Adidas bag buried beneath a tree stump. Inside was a robe and a Bible, one that has your father's name written inside. Marcus felt his heartbeat skip. For the first time in 25 years, there was physical proof, something real. "We'd like you to come and confirm the items," she added. "We have a unit nearby that can bring you to the location, if you're willing." "I'll be ready," he said without hesitation. After hanging up, Marcus quickly got dressed, his mind racing with questions. As he passed the living room, the sermon still played on the TV. For years, he had turned away from anything spiritual, unable to reconcile faith with his father's disappearance. But now, something felt different. When the officers arrived, Marcus joined them silently. They drove out of town, leaving the paved roads behind, heading deep into the forest. The farther they went, the more Marcus wondered how anything, let alone a clue, could have ended up so far from civilization. When they arrived, the area was buzzing with activity. Police had roped off a section of forest. Officers were photographing a large, rotted tree stump, and a small tent had been set up nearby. Detective Miller met him at the edge of the site, a no-nonsense woman in her early 50s with sharp, focused eyes. "Mr. Freeman," she said, "this is Tom Jenkins, the logger who found the bag." Tom, a burly man with sun-weathered skin, offered a handshake. "Sorry it's under these circumstances." Marcus nodded. "Can you tell me how you found it?" Tom pointed toward the base of the tree stump. "We were clearing out the area, and I noticed something strange. Started digging by hand, no way to get equipment out here, and found the bag tucked right under the old roots. When I saw what was inside, I knew I had to call the authorities." Marcus stared at the stump. "How would it end up there?" "Looks like someone dug out the space under the tree after cutting it down," Tom explained. "See how the stumps rotted through? Easier to dig under. Whoever did this planned it." Detective Miller gestured for them to move to the nearby tent where the bag had been placed on a table. Officers carefully unzipped it using gloves. The contents were damp, but mostly intact. First, they pulled out the Bible. Despite the moisture damage, the name on the inside cover was still visible. Marcus leaned in and instantly recognized the handwriting, the same familiar pen strokes he'd seen on notes and letters growing up. "That's his," Marcus whispered. "That's my father's handwriting." One officer gently flipped to the back of the Bible, where a folded page had been tucked between the covers. It looked like a personal note, possibly a prayer. But as Marcus read it, he realized it wasn't just a prayer. It was something deeper, a plea, a message that might change everything. The note found in the Bible wasn't just a prayer. It was a cry for help, a plea to understand why there was so much darkness in the world, and a desperate request for strength to resist those trying to pull him away from his faith. Marcus swallowed hard. "That's definitely my father's handwriting," he said, voice thick. "It's strong, unmistakable. I remember watching him write just like that in his study when he used to teach me." Next, they examined the robe. Detective Miller handled it with care. "We know it's been buried since the late 70s, but we can now use modern lab testing to gather more information. Because our town's limited in resources, we'll need to send this to a state or federal facility for full analysis." Marcus gently touched the fabric, his fingertips brushing over the folds. "This is his size. I'm certain this belonged to my father." Then a darker thought crossed his mind. "Do you think someone did this to him? That something happened out here?" Miller examined the robe again. "There's no visible damage. If someone had harmed your father and hidden these items, we'd likely see some trace, markings, damage, something. But back when he first went missing, there was no clear sign of a crime. No one ever reported anything suspicious. It's possible, though hard to accept, that your father walked away. From the church, from his role, maybe even from everything." Marcus shook his head, firm and unwavering. "No, that's not who he was. My father wasn't the kind of man to run from his beliefs. And if he truly wanted to disappear, why bury this so deep out here, in the middle of nowhere?" He stared at the old Adidas bag. "I've never seen this before. It's not something my father would have owned. He lived simply. Nothing about this fits." Tom Jenkins, the logger, agreed. "You don't dig that deep unless you've got time and a reason, especially not under a tree that big. Even with it rotted, that takes real effort. A lone man wouldn't do it quickly." Detective Miller nodded thoughtfully. "We'll keep all this in mind. For now, we're exploring every possibility. Were there people who didn't get along with your father, maybe in the community or at the church?" Marcus sighed. "This was the Ozarks in the 70s. My father was a black pastor in a small, deeply traditional town. Of course, there were tensions, but he never wronged anyone. He stood his ground, preached peace, and lived by his values." "We'll go back through the old files," Miller said. "Revisit every piece of evidence we can. In the meantime, we'll keep you updated." Marcus asked if he could receive photographs of the items. An officer assured him they'd provide digital copies of everything once the initial documentation was complete. With that, Marcus was allowed to return home, while officers secured the site and coordinated with forensics. As he left, Miller turned her attention back to the logger, discussing how to restrict further access to the site now that it was considered part of an ongoing investigation. When the patrol car brought Marcus back, he didn't go straight inside. Instead, he walked to the spare room he had turned into a replica of his father's study, the place where all the pastor's personal belongings were now kept. The old bookshelves still held his father's sermon notes. Each notebook was neatly labeled, a reflection of the man's careful nature. The pages had yellowed over time, but remained intact. Marcus ran his fingers over the spine of one, remembering the first time he had read them as a teenager. He was 15 when he began learning directly from his father, preparing for a life of service. Now, at 42, those moments felt distant, like echoes from another life. He pulled a few volumes down, wanting to reconnect with those teachings, not just to remember, but to prove to himself that his father had been committed to his path, not someone who would have simply walked away. As he flipped through the notebooks, a troubling detail stood out. The year 1977, the year his father vanished, was missing from the shelf. He searched the room again. Nothing. Then he checked the bedroom cabinet where his father's personal diaries were stored. Still, everything stopped before that year. Not a single page from 1977. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, confused. His father had always been meticulous. He didn't skip years or leave gaps. Why would those notes be missing? Maybe, Marcus thought, he had left those final sermons at the church. Back then, Reverend Freeman was a full-time pastor at Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church. Perhaps those writings were stored there. Marcus thought back to the day he had collected his father's belongings after the disappearance, how grief had clouded his judgment, how little he had paid attention to details. Determined, he picked up one of the older sermon notebooks, tucked it under his arm, and made his way to the car. He hadn't set foot in Mount Olive in 25 years. As he drove, memories flooded in. His father's powerful voice echoing through the church, the warmth of the congregation, the way sermons would roll through the sanctuary like thunder and settle gently on the heart. And for the first time in decades, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. The faint, fragile stir of hope. Marcus didn't try to block the emotions. He let them come, wave after wave, as he thought of the man who had raised him. A man of quiet strength, unwavering conviction, and a deep devotion to his calling. The drive to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church was short, just 10 minutes, but it felt much longer. When Marcus pulled into the lot, the building looked older, smaller somehow. Time had weathered its once bright features. At 17, it had seemed majestic. Now, at 42, it looked like a memory frozen in wood and stained glass. He sat for a moment, staring at the entrance before finally stepping out. He hadn't been inside a church in decades, certainly not this one. But today wasn't about belief. It was about finding the truth. The inside hadn't changed much. The pews still gleamed with polish. Colored light poured through the stained glass windows, dancing across the worn floor. At the front stood the pulpit, dignified and still, just as he remembered. An elderly man stood near the altar, adjusting hymn books. He turned as Marcus approached. "Can I help you, son?" the man asked gently. "I hope so," Marcus replied. "I'm looking for someone who might have known my father." The man introduced himself as Pastor Harold Whitmore. Marcus recognized the name instantly. He'd seen this man dozens of times as a teen. Though age had drawn deeper lines into his face, there was no mistaking him. Pastor Harold had served alongside Reverend Elijah Freeman. "I'm Marcus Freeman," he said, "Elijah's son." For a moment, Harold just stared, processing the name. Then his face softened with recognition and emotion. "Marcus, my goodness, we haven't seen you since my father vanished," Marcus finished quietly. Harold nodded, his voice now lower. "We've missed you. How have you been holding up?" "My faith didn't survive what happened," Marcus admitted. "Even now I struggle to understand it." Before Harold could respond, the church's side door opened. Another elderly man stepped in, Reverend George Langston. Harold turned to greet him. "George, look who's here." Reverend Langston's eyes widened when he saw Marcus. "Elijah's boy?" he asked, moving closer. "It's really you." The three stood together for a moment, letting the years melt away. Then Marcus explained why he had come, about the bag found in the forest, the robe and Bible, and how police now believed his father may have walked away from his life or worse. "I need answers," Marcus said. "You both worked beside him. Do you think he could have abandoned everything like that?" The two older men were silent at first. Then Pastor Harold spoke. "Your father was deeply respected, a kind, wise man. But the truth is, no one can fully know another man's struggles." Reverend George added quietly, "He never gave us any reason to think he was troubled. But in the final weeks before he vanished, he began staying later at the church. We sometimes heard him praying alone, long, anguished prayers. Marcus nodded, then shared the real reason for his visit. "I'm looking for the sermon notebook from 1977, the year he disappeared, and his personal journal from that same year. I have every other volume at home, except that one." He pulled the older notebook he'd brought from home out of his bag and placed it in Harold's hands. He always used this kind of notebook, same brand, same style. "But everything from 1977 is missing." Harold examined it thoughtfully. "I don't remember ever seeing these before. If we had, we would have handed them to the police right away." "Still," George said, "let's have a look." They made their way to the church office, the same room Reverend Freeman had once used. It now belonged to George. They scoured the shelves, opened drawers, checked old file boxes. Still nothing. They moved to the small library, searching every cabinet, drawer, and storage box. An hour passed, as dust clung to their fingertips, and the quiet weight of history filled the air. Marcus placed the old notebook on a table beside him, hoping it would somehow lead to a clue. But the missing volumes were nowhere to be found. Eventually, Marcus turned to the men. "Thank you. I know it's been a long time. I really appreciate you trying." "You're always welcome here," Pastor Harold said gently. Before leaving, Marcus stopped at one of the pews and knelt. The act felt foreign, awkward after so many years. But in that quiet moment, he closed his eyes and whispered, "If you're really there, and if you truly did rise again, then please just show me what happened to my father." Marcus stepped out of the church and made his way back to the car, unaware that in his distracted state, he had left something important behind. His father's old sermon notebook still resting on the table in the church library. Driving away, his thoughts were heavy, replaying Pastor Harold's words about his father's final days. The image of Reverend Elijah Freeman, alone in the church, praying through the night, haunted him. Were those prayers a sign of someone unraveling? Could it really be that his father had chosen to walk away? Or worse? And then another memory surfaced, the loss of his mother in 1976, just a year before his father disappeared. Her death had shaken the entire family, but his father had taken it the hardest. Grief like that could change a man. Without much thought, Marcus turned off his usual route and headed toward the town's edge, toward the cemetery where his mother rested. Before crossing over, he stopped at a small flower shop across the street. An older woman behind the counter wrapped a modest bouquet with quiet care. "Special occasion?" she asked with a warm smile. "Just visiting my mom," Marcus replied. "It's been a long time." The cemetery was quiet, wrapped in a golden stillness as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The path was familiar. He'd walked it many times as a teenager, especially after both his parents were gone. He found her stone, Sarah Freeman, beloved wife and mother, and gently placed the flowers down. Then he sat on the grass, like he used to, and let the silence hold him. "Hi, Mom," he said softly. "It's been a while." He told her everything about the discovery in the forest, the robe and Bible, the pastors, and the strange possibility that his father's disappearance might not have been what everyone assumed. Speaking the words out loud brought an unexpected comfort. "I don't know what happened to Dad," he admitted. "I've been angry. At him. At everything. But now, I just want to understand." Just then, a soft sound interrupted the stillness, quiet sobs coming from somewhere nearby. Marcus stood and followed the sound. A few rows down, beneath the shade of an old oak tree, a young boy sat alone, knees pulled to his chest, face streaked with tears. "Hey there," Marcus said gently, crouching down a few feet away. "Are you all right?" The boy looked up. He couldn't have been more than 10. "What's your name?" "Robbie," he sniffled. "Robbie Hark." "Where are your parents, Robbie?" Robbie didn't answer right away. Then, silently, he pointed toward a nearby grave. Marcus's heart sank. "Is someone here with you? A guardian?" or anyone. The boy shook his head. I can take you home, Marcus offered softly. Or call someone for you. Please. Not home, Robbie whispered. They don't like me there. My aunt and uncle. The words struck a chord. Marcus knew that pain. After losing his parents, he too had been placed with relatives who saw him more as a responsibility than family. I understand, he said, voice low. I'll stay with you for a bit, but eventually, someone will need to know where you are. He gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and immediately felt it, heat radiating through the fabric of his jacket. Robbie, you've got a fever, Marcus said, suddenly alarmed. You need to see a doctor. Please, not home, Robbie repeated, his voice trembling. Can you take me to your house? Marcus shook his head. I can't do that, but I can take you to the hospital. You need help. Robbie hesitated, then looked up at him again. Could we go to a church instead? Marcus blinked. A church? The hospital would be better. They can treat you. The boy looked down. When my mom was alive, if I got sick, she'd go to church. She'd ask for the special communion to bring home. She'd give it to me and pray, and I'd feel better. Marcus's breath caught. He remembered those days. His father had often prepared communion for members of the congregation who were ill or homebound. Marcus had helped pack the small kits himself. My father did the same, he said. He was a pastor at Mount Olive. Then an idea came to him. How about this? If you come with me to the hospital, I'll get the communion from the church and bring it to you. We'll take it together there. Would that be okay? The boy wiped his nose and gave a small nod. As they walked toward the car, Marcus suddenly froze. He hadn't seen his father's notebook since leaving the church. I left the book, he muttered to himself, realizing it was still on the library table. I'll have to go back for it. He helped Robbie into the car and drove him to the emergency room, explaining the situation to the staff as best he could. He didn't know the boy's full address, but hoped the hospital could piece that together. Before being taken in, Robbie looked up at Marcus. You promised, he said quietly. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. I remember. I'll be back. After filling out the paperwork and offering to cover the boy's care, Marcus stepped back outside. The sky had turned deeper now, the sun dipping low. He got into his car, pulled up the old contact number for Mount Olive Church, and made a call. No one answered. Marcus decided not to wait for a call back. He got in his car and headed straight to the church. When he arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. Inside, the building was quiet. He walked through the familiar halls looking for Pastor Harold or Reverend George, but neither was around. Instead, a young staff member approached him, someone Marcus didn't recognize. Can I help you, sir? The young man asked politely. I'm looking for Pastor Harold or Reverend George, Marcus replied. Are they here? The staffer shook his head. They're at the cemetery right now, performing blessings. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That didn't sound like any tradition he remembered. In all his years at the church, cemetery blessings weren't part of the routine, especially not this late in the day. Is that something they do often? He asked. The staff member shrugged. It's been that way since I started here. I don't question it. Marcus nodded slowly. I was actually here earlier today. I left something behind in the library, an old sermon notebook. Also, I need a take-home Holy Communion set. It's for a sick child at the hospital. The staff member didn't hesitate. I can help with both. Let's check the library first. Together they walked down the hallway. As soon as they stepped into the library, Marcus spotted the notebook, still sitting exactly where he'd left it on the table. A wave of relief passed through him. He picked it up, noticing that the stacks of books from the earlier search had since been returned neatly to the shelves. As his eyes scanned the room, something on the top shelf caught his attention, a book slightly ajar, sticking out awkwardly like it had been disturbed. It teetered near the edge. I should fix that before it falls, Marcus said, reaching up. The staff member started to protest. "I can take care of it later." But Marcus, taller than most, was already reaching for it. As he pulled the book forward, he realized it was heavier than expected. It slipped from his hands and landed on the floor with a loud thud, pages fanning open. "Sorry about that," he said quickly, kneeling to pick it up. The title read, "Church Financial Management and Stewardship." But it wasn't the title that caught his attention. It was the handwriting in the margins, sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably his father's. "Is this book available to borrow?" Marcus asked, trying to sound casual. The staff member looked uncertain. "We'd have to log it properly, but sure." After the book was signed out, Marcus asked another question. "Would it be all right if I came with you to the sacristy? I used to help there when my father, Reverend Elijah Freeman, served here." The young man hesitated. "I've heard of Reverend Freeman, sir, but unfortunately no. We don't allow anyone back there." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Of course, I understand." While he waited in the hall, he opened the book. It was filled with notes, page after page of underlined text and personal reflections in his father's handwriting. One passage stood out. "God sees how we handle his money." This isn't just bookkeeping. It's a matter of integrity. Next to it, a note written in the margin, "Accountability to God first, then to the congregation." But what truly unsettled Marcus was something he almost missed: the faint indentations of erased pencil marks. His father had a habit of pressing hard when he wrote. Holding the page up to the light, Marcus could just make out two names, Harold Whitmore, George Langston. Both names were circled, each followed by a question mark. His eyes dropped to a heavily underlined section about embezzlement, with margin notes discussing how to address financial misconduct with grace but firmness. Marcus slowly closed the book, his pulse rising. Had his father suspected something? Had he been trying to handle it quietly, only to vanish before he could act? From the hallway window, Marcus caught a glimpse of two figures moving among the gravestones. He recognized the silhouettes. It had to be Pastor Harold and Reverend George. But in the fading light, something about the scene felt off. Just then, the staff member returned, handing Marcus a small cloth bag. "Here you go. Take home communion set." "Thank you," Marcus said, accepting it. Then he glanced back toward the window. "Do you know what they're actually doing out there? Pastor Harold and Reverend George, I can see them from here." The staff member looked. "Just blessings, like I mentioned. I was in the cellar cleaning before you arrived, so I don't know when they started, but they should be finishing up soon." Marcus thanked him again and left the building, sermon notebook and borrowed book under one arm, the communion set in hand. But as he stepped outside into the cooling air, something in his gut turned. There was something hidden at Mount Olive, and it had been hiding for a long time. Marcus had been heading toward his car, but something made him stop, a quiet instinct, a tug of unfinished business. He turned back and decided to walk over to the cemetery. He wanted to thank Pastor Harold and Reverend George again, and maybe see their reaction to his return visit. The cemetery sat just behind the church, separated by a narrow stretch of grass. As he walked closer, the light was dimming fast, but what he saw made him freeze. Reverend George was shoveling dirt onto a small mound. Beside him, Pastor Harold stood holding a dark canvas bag. They hadn't seen him yet. "Good evening," Marcus called out, raising his voice so they wouldn't be startled. Both men jumped, visibly caught off guard. In the fading light, their faces flickered with unmistakable tension and recognition. "Marcus," Pastor Harold's voice cracked slightly. "What are you doing back here?" "Didn't mean to startle you," Marcus said, approaching calmly. "I came back for a book I left in the library, and to pick up a take-home communion for a sick boy I met at the hospital." His eyes drifted to the shovel, then back to the bag in Harold's hands. "What exactly are you doing out here at this hour?" The two men exchanged a hurried look. "We were just," Pastor Harold began. "Blessing the graveyard," Reverend George cut in quickly. "We noticed an old plot. It belonged to a member's pet." "A dog?" Pastor Harold nodded emphatically. "Yes, and we had the owner's permission to relocate the remains. Space is limited in the cemetery now, so we're preparing for future needs." Marcus glanced down at the freshly disturbed soil, then back at their uneasy faces. The story sounded off. A midnight grave relocation for a dog, using a shovel and a canvas bag? Still, he didn't push it. "I see," he said, voice even. "Just wanted to say thank you again for earlier. I didn't mean to interrupt." Pastor Harold's eyes shifted to the book tucked under Marcus's arm. "You found another book in the library?" "Yes," Marcus replied. "It fell from the top shelf. I noticed my father's handwriting inside. The young staff member helped me check it out." There was a subtle change in Reverend George's posture, a tightening of the shoulders. "That book," he said slowly, "was one your father reviewed quite a bit. Just be sure to return it Sunday." "Of course," Marcus said. "I'll let you get back to your work. I promised the boy I'd bring him communion." He turned and walked away, acutely aware of their eyes following him the entire way. Once inside his car, Marcus didn't start the engine right away. Through the window, he watched the two men. They hadn't resumed digging. Instead, they stood close together, speaking in low tones. Their body language had changed. No longer routine, now guarded, intense. He was just about to leave when his phone rang. "This is Nurse Jenkins from County General," the voice on the line said. "The boy you brought in, Robbie, he's asking for you. His relatives have arrived too." "Thank you," Marcus said. "Tell him I'm on my way." He was about to pull out when movement across the cemetery caught his eye. Under a street lamp on the far end, Reverend George was loading the shovel and the canvas bag into the back of his car. Moments later, he climbed in and drove off, using a different exit than the church's main lot. Pastor Harold, meanwhile, was walking quickly back toward the church, slipping in through a side door. Marcus felt the hairs on his neck stand up. Something wasn't right. He started the car and turned toward the hospital. But as he neared the final intersection before County General, a flash of headlights caught his attention. It was Reverend George's car. He watched it speed through the yellow light and turn sharply, not toward any residential neighborhood or known parishioner's home, but toward the winding, isolated forest roads that led into the Ozark foothills. Marcus's gut twisted. That road didn't lead to any homes, no cabins, just wilderness. Why would a church leader be heading there at night with a shovel and a sealed bag? Without overthinking it, Marcus made the turn and began to follow, keeping his headlights low and his distance wide. He hated delaying his promise to Robbie, but something in his spirit told him this mattered. This wasn't routine. Something was happening, something bigger than a late-night ritual. As the Reverend's car disappeared deeper into the forest, Marcus pulled out his phone and called the only person who might believe him. "Detective Miller, it's Marcus Freeman." "Mr. Freeman, is everything okay?" "I'm not sure," Marcus said, eyes locked on the red taillights weaving ahead through the trees. "I think something is very wrong. I'm following Reverend George Langston from Mount Olive Church. Earlier this evening, he was digging in the church cemetery and claimed it was to relocate a pet's grave. But now he's speeding into the mountains with a shovel and a bag he said contained remains." There was silence on the line, the kind that says, "You've got their full attention." "Can you keep eyes on him?" Miller finally asked. "I'm trying," Marcus replied, voice steady. "But I think you should come. This doesn't feel like a blessing." There was a tense silence on the line before Detective Miller spoke again. "Mr. Freeman, don't pursue him. Turn back now. We'll handle this." "I can't," Marcus said, gripping the wheel tighter. He could be destroying something connected to my father's disappearance. I have to know what he's doing." "I understand," she replied, exhaling sharply. "But if you insist on continuing, do not approach him. Stay out of sight, maintain a safe distance, and keep this line open. My team is en route." "Understood," Marcus said, locking his focus on the taillights ahead as the car in front of him turned deeper into the woods. He narrated everything to Miller as he drove: the book he found at the church, the notes in his father's handwriting, the names circled and then erased, the strange cemetery behavior. Questions kept flooding his mind. Who had erased the notes? Why had the book been hidden on a top shelf that looked recently disturbed? Had someone tried to keep it from him? "We're on Mountain View Road now," Marcus said. "Northeast, about 5 miles past the town limits. The road's getting narrower. Elevation's climbing. Not much out here except trees, cliffs, and a few overlook points. Officers are about 10 minutes behind you," Miller confirmed. "Stay safe and don't lose sight of him." Just then, the brake lights ahead flared red. "He's stopping," Marcus whispered, "pulling into the Eagle Point overlook." Marcus coasted his car into a bend in the road about 100 yards back, half hidden behind brush and rock. From his vantage point, he saw Reverend George step out of his vehicle, put on a headlamp, and lift a large plastic bag and a shovel from the trunk. Without hesitation, the Reverend made his way to the guardrail, then began descending the wooden staircase that led to the lower platform, a narrow trail running along the cliffside. "He's going down the trail," Marcus told the detective. "He's carrying the bag and shovel, heading straight toward the edge. That trail is dangerous in daylight. At night, it's almost suicidal." "Stay in your car, Mr. Freeman," Miller ordered. "Help is minutes away." But Marcus couldn't just sit still. The only reason to go down that trail with a bag and shovel was to get close to the cliff, to drop something over it. "I need to know what he's carrying," Marcus said. "I'm not going to confront him. Just stall until you arrive." Without waiting for permission, he grabbed a flashlight, quietly exited his car, and followed the beam of the headlamp down the stairs into the darkness. "Reverend George!" Marcus called out once he was near the lower platform. The Reverend froze. His headlamp swung around, blinding Marcus briefly before shifting aside. When their eyes met, the older man's expression was a mixture of shock and anger. "What are you doing here?" the Reverend barked. "You've been following me?" "I saw you leave town at high speed. I got worried," Marcus said, walking cautiously. "It's not safe out here. What's in the bag, Reverend?" George didn't answer. A long pause filled the space between them, broken only by the wind and the distant rush of the river below. Then, in a quiet voice, George said, "So, you figured it out, didn't you?" "Figured what out?" Marcus asked, still piecing things together. "Don't act like you don't know," George snapped. At that exact moment, police sirens echoed through the forest. Red and blue lights flickered far above them on the ridge. George's head turned sharply. His expression changed, panic setting in. "You called the police?" he gasped. The plastic bag fell from his hands, landing with a heavy thud on the wooden platform. The sound it made was not the soft impact of soil. Something solid had struck the boards inside that bag. Marcus stepped forward and quickly opened it. Inside were not just clumps of earth, but 2 books, covered in dust and old grave matter. Even in the dim light, Marcus recognized them: his father's missing sermon notebook from 1977 and his father's personal diary. "You were going to get rid of these," Marcus said, disbelief and anger swelling in his chest. "You hid them from me. You were burying the evidence. And that bag," his voice cracked, "that wasn't a dog in the cemetery, was it? That was my father. Those were his remains." More sirens howled above, flashlights cut through the night. Then Detective Miller's voice rang out, loud and clear. "Police! Stay where you are!" George spun in a panic, looking from Marcus to the distant officers, and then, without warning, He bolted. "No!" Marcus shouted as George climbed over the wooden railing separating the trail from the edge of the cliff. "Don't do this!" George turned back. His voice was calm, almost resigned. "This is better than what comes next." He shifted his weight. Marcus lunged forward, dropping the bag, reaching out, but he was too late. George leaned forward toward the cliff's edge. But before he could jump, 2 officers burst onto the lower platform. They grabbed him by the arms, pulling him back over the railing despite his furious struggle and desperate pleas to be left alone. "You won't be facing any divine judgment tonight," one of the officers said, locking the Reverend's arms behind him. "First, you're going to answer to the world." Detective Miller immediately radioed for backup, instructing units to detain Pastor Harold at the church. She suspected George hadn't acted alone. The scene was secured. Officers carefully collected the bag and its contents. Reverend George was read his rights, his expression blank as he was led to a waiting police vehicle. Detective Miller approached Marcus, who was still standing near the edge, visibly shaken. "I told you not to approach him," she said, her voice stern but not unkind. Seeing the weight of it all on Marcus's face, she softened. "But I understand why you did." She paused, then added, "We'll need you to come to the station. The items you recovered, we need you to identify them officially." Marcus nodded, still struggling to process what had nearly happened. He glanced at the bag on the ground. He was going to throw away everything. My father's ashes, his words, the truth. If I hadn't followed him... He trailed off, then steadied his voice. "I just have one request. Could someone call the hospital and let them know I'll be late? The boy's expecting me with the communion." "We'll take care of it," Miller promised. As they made their way back to the parking lot, Marcus took one last look down toward the overlook, fully grasping how close everything had come to being lost forever. Not just the physical evidence, but the answers he'd been chasing for 25 years. Back at the station, Marcus parked behind the patrol units. To his surprise, Reverend George wasn't the only one in custody. Pastor Harold, already in handcuffs, was being escorted toward a holding cell. Detective Miller led Marcus to a secure conference room. Evidence bags were carefully arranged on the table under bright lights. Inside them, his father's long-missing 1977 sermon notebook, the personal diary, the financial textbook with marginal notes, a sample of grave soil containing bone fragments, and the shovel. Marcus's eyes fell on the fragments, pale, brittle, unmistakable. "Are those?" he began. "We believe they are your father's remains," Miller said gently. "We'll confirm through DNA testing." Marcus swayed slightly, but remained upright, his face pale. "What happens next?" "First," Miller said, "we need your full statement. Then, we'll go through the recovered items, and you'll need to confirm what belongs to your father." Over the next hour, Marcus recounted everything, from the moment the forest discovery was reported to the final moments at Eagle Point. He shared what he'd found in the church finance book, the erased names, the growing suspicions, and the inconsistencies that had pushed him to act. While Marcus gave his statement, forensic experts worked quietly at the far end of the room. One of them stepped forward, handling the damaged diary with extreme care. "This piece has seen extensive deterioration," the technician explained. "The leather cover is nearly destroyed, and a lot of the pages have fused into pulp, but we've managed to separate a few." "Can anything be read?" Miller asked. "Barely, but some entries are legible." Marcus stepped closer as the technician carefully angled the page under a light. The faded handwriting was unmistakable, his father's. "I can't ignore this any longer. The missing funds now exceed $10,000. I confronted Harold and George privately. They denied everything, but the evidence is clear. I've prayed for guidance on how to proceed without harming the church. But they must be held accountable." One of the officers nearby murmured, "It's a miracle that page survived at all." Another added, And that finance book, the way it was hidden in plain sight, someone thought it was safe up there. After erasing the names, they probably figured it wouldn't be questioned. Maybe the books were buried later than the body, a tech suggested. If they'd gone underground with the remains 25 years ago, they'd be unreadable by now. They turned to the sermon notebook next. This one was in far better condition. Miller theorized it had been kept in the church somewhere dry, likely stashed away until recently, when the cover-up began to unravel. Inside were Elijah Freeman's sermons from January through early April 1977. Marcus scanned the entries, his father's themes echoing loudly now. Honesty, redemption, courage, truth. One sermon stood out. Its title was written in bold strokes: "The Courage to Confront Evil with Love." The passage cited Matthew 18:15-17, a scripture about confronting wrongdoing with grace and firmness. "If we see injustice, especially within the church," his father had written, "we must speak, first privately, then with witnesses, and if there is no repentance, then before the congregation. This isn't about punishment, it's about truth. It's about restoration." Processing took hours. Officers came and went. Then one returned with a quiet update. "Pastor Harold is still denying any wrongdoing, but Reverend George broke down in the interrogation room. He's been crying for the past hour," the officer said quietly. "He says he deserves everything that's coming to him. He confessed." Marcus sat down heavily as the officer continued. "According to Reverend George, both he and Harold deeply resented your father, Mr. Freeman. Some of it was personal, some of it racial. It was the 1970s in rural Arkansas. But mostly, it was because your father found out they were embezzling church funds, and he refused to stay silent." The words hit like a wave. "George said your father gave them a choice: confess in front of the congregation and step down, or he'd expose them himself that Sunday." The officer's voice lowered. That confrontation never happened. Instead, on a Friday evening in 1977, they lured him into the church basement. A fight broke out. They strangled him, wrapped his body in a robe from the church sacristy, then buried him in secret, not in a proper grave, but beneath an old pet burial plot. They desecrated the spot, placing his body under tree roots where no one would think to look. Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of it all pressing down. The other items, the Bible, the robe, his personal effects, they packed those in that old Adidas bag, paid someone using church funds to bury it under a large tree stump out in the forest. The location was remote, but known to them in case they ever needed to move it. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. All this time, how did no one question it? Detective Miller stepped in. "They used their influence to mislead the early investigation. Claimed your father had simply walked away from his life. The town was already divided. No one pushed. Eventually, the case just faded." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "But how you found that bag and the books? That's something else. Call it what you will. Coincidence, persistence, or maybe something greater." Marcus looked down at his father's sermon notebook, at the words written in a steady, uncompromising hand, calling for truth, integrity, and courage. Even in his final days, Reverend Elijah Freeman had chosen grace. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "They'll be charged with murder, obstruction, and embezzlement," Miller said. "With a confession and this much evidence, they're not going anywhere for the rest of their lives. And your father, once we confirm everything through testing, you'll be able to give him the kind of burial he deserved." Marcus nodded, holding back tears. After 25 years, he can finally rest, and people will know the truth. He looked over the table one last time. "Maybe it really was divine intervention," he said softly. Later that night, Marcus arrived at the hospital. The sky was dark now, visiting hours long over. But when he explained to the staff what had happened, they made an exception. In the pediatric wing, Robbie lay in bed, awake. His fever had broken, though he still looked pale. His aunt and uncle sat beside him, visibly exhausted but grateful. "Mr. Freeman," the aunt said, rising as Marcus entered. "Thank you for everything you did." Marcus introduced himself fully, and to his surprise, the name Freeman sparked recognition. "You're related to Reverend Freeman, the one who vanished?" the uncle asked. Marcus nodded. "He was my father." "I remember that story," the man said. "People around here never forgot. Even years later, it was always whispered about." Robbie smiled weakly from the bed. "Where were you? I waited for you." Marcus sat at his side. "I'm sorry, Robbie. Something important happened. I had to help the police." "Are you a cop too?" the boy asked, wide-eyed. Marcus smiled. "No, just someone who showed up at the right time." He took out the small communion set, still wrapped in cloth. Robbie's aunt looked skeptical. "There's no pastor here," she said gently. "How can we—" Marcus looked her in the eye. "I'm not a pastor. I'm not perfect. But faith doesn't require a title. It requires trust and heart. That's all God asks of us." The woman nodded slowly. With quiet reverence, Marcus opened the communion kit and laid out the bread and juice on Robbie's tray table. He spoke the words he had heard his father say so many times, the words of peace, remembrance, and healing. He broke the bread, shared it with the boy with his guardians, and took a piece for himself. As they sat together in that hospital room, sharing communion under fluorescent lights and soft beeping monitors, something lifted inside Marcus, a weight he'd carried for most of his life. Gone. Afterward, Robbie looked at him and asked, "Will I see you again?" Marcus nodded. "I think so. And maybe, if you'd like, you and your family could visit Mount Olive Church. They may need some help rebuilding soon." Robbie smiled and gave him a hug. "I want to grow up to be like you," he whispered. That night, as Marcus drove home under a sky full of stars, he prayed, truly prayed, for the first time in 25 years. It wasn't a perfect prayer, but it was honest. He thanked God for not giving up on him, even when he'd given up on God. He thought back on the strange path that led him here. A sick boy at a cemetery, a forgotten notebook on a church table, a late-night detour that uncovered the truth. Every small step had led him to this. Evil had hidden the truth for decades, but truth and love had endured. His father's life had not ended in disgrace, but in courage, and now Marcus would make sure the world knew it. As he pulled into his driveway, he looked up at the stars once more and whispered, "Thank you for guiding me back." After 25 years of silence, Marcus Freeman had found peace. His father was gone, but finally honored. The truth had risen, and faith had come home.